The cover says, I went to Greenland and I saw a warning for Canada. Inside the story, my real thesis statement is that I basically saw a story of loyalty and betrayal. The warning as I see it is we cannot be on both sides of this issue. You cannot be there supporting Greenland and also be doing war exercises with the American military at the same time that the American president is threatening to take over the place.
Since coming to office for the second time in January 2025, U.S. President Donald Trump has insisted that his country needs Greenland for strategic reasons. He's even threatened to take Greenland by military force if necessary. Trump's public threats to annex Greenland have rattled both the island's residents and the NATO alliance. I'm Adrian Harewood, and this is In Bed with the Elephant. Quote, "The people of Greenland want to be with the United States. They want a closer relationship with the United States. They want more military presence in Greenland. They want to free themselves from Danish control. And so now it is just a matter of making that happen," unquote. Those are the words of Jeff Landry, the U.S. Special Envoy to Greenland. The Donald Trump loyalist, who is also the Republican governor of Louisiana, made the claims in late June 2026 while appearing on The Alex Marlow Show, a podcast on the conservative Breitbart News Network. Most of Greenland lies north of the Arctic Circle. Greenland is an autonomous territory within the Kingdom of Denmark. 80% of it is covered by an ice sheet. The massive resource-rich island, the largest in the world, has a population of about 57,000 people, 90% of whom are Greenlandic Inuit or Kalaaleet, the indigenous people of the territory. And yet, due to climate change and shrinking ice, Greenland has increasingly found itself at the center of global politics. How are the people of Greenland doing? How are they dealing with the barrage of threats to their sovereignty by a purported ally? What are the implications of Greenland's precarious relationship with the United States for its Arctic neighbor, Canada? Canada and Greenland share a sizable maritime border and a short land border on Hans Island. Brett Popplewell traveled to Greenland in February to see how locals were responding to the U.S. president's threats to annex their country. He wrote a cover story about his experience for the June 2026 edition of the Walrus magazine. It's called "I Went to Greenland and Saw a Warning for Canada: How the Resource-Rich Arctic Territory Braced for Invasion." Brett Popplewell is a National Magazine Award-winning writer and associate professor of journalism at Carleton University. He's also the author of the best-selling book Outsider: An Old Man, a Mountain, and the Search for a Hidden Path. And full disclosure, Brett and I are colleagues at Carleton University School of Journalism and Communication in Ottawa. Brett Popplewell, welcome to In Bed with the Elephant.
Thanks for having me.
It's great to see you.
Where's the elephant?
It's always in the room.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. It's in the room. It's here.
I think we're going to talk about it today, aren't we?
I think so. Well, one thing we're definitely going to talk about is Greenland. That's really the focus of our conversation today. I'm curious as to what conception you had of Greenland before you actually landed in Nuuk, the capital.
I didn't really know what to make of it. I've always known that it was there on the map. I didn't understand fully just how close it really is to Canada. And I say that meaning geographically and also culturally, especially with the Inuit population in the north of Canada. I think I grew up, as many of us did, seeing Greenland and under, the name Greenland would be in brackets Denmark or Danish. And it just always sort of was something that we sort of put in our minds as something that kind of was drifting over towards Europe. But they are our neighbor.
They really are. I think the closest distance between Greenland and Canada is like 26 kilometers. Really, it's on our border.
Yeah. I mean, we are certainly the closest country to Greenland, and they are. Yeah, we basically have two neighbors here. We have the United States and we have Greenland. And
this is a vast territory. This is 800,000 square miles, as they say.
I'll take your word for that.
It's the biggest island in the world.
We have this misperception, though, of its size because on our maps, it is stretched because of something that we call the Mercator projection. It basically makes Greenland look the size of Africa. But it is not that big. It is significantly smaller, but it is the largest island on the planet.
Yeah, it's like the size, I think it's the size of Saudi Arabia or Mexico or the DRC, the Democratic Republic of Congo.
It's a huge landmass that is largely untouched and unscarred by human hand.
In your article in the Walrus, you write that Greenland possesses a vastness that must be seen to be understood. For people who've never been there, can you try to describe what Greenland looks like?
So from the sky, it's just an endless sprawling mountain range. It's not like an ice sheet. You don't see the ice. There is an ice sheet on it that's 3 kilometers thick in parts, but when you're actually looking down at it, it is just this endless mountain chain. It's huge. It is absolutely huge.
Why did you decide to go? And what were you looking for in going?
I decided to go. Now, Greenland was never a place that I was drawn to, but the night that Nicolas Maduro was, choose your verb here, arrested, ousted, detained.
We are continuing to follow breaking news from Venezuela, where U.S.-led strikes inside the country today have led to the capture of President Nicolas Maduro.
Multiple explosions heard through the Venezuelan capital. Trump made the announcement on Truth Social confirming the attack.
All Venezuelan military capacities were rendered powerless as the men and women of our military working with U.S. law enforcement successfully captured Maduro in the dead of night. It was dark. The lights of Caracas were largely turned off.
When the Americans basically turned off the lights in Caracas and went in and removed him, I thought, ooh, this is kind of a warning sign to others. And sure enough, the very next day, Donald Trump was in a bit of a mood and was talking again about how America needed Greenland for its security. And that was the moment when I reached out to my editor at the Walrus and said, I think we should go to Greenland. It was very much a sense of like the dominoes are lining up and could fall. I also had been reading about how the Danish were taking the threats coming from the United States very seriously and were starting to dispatch soldiers. And they were not the only ones, that NATO was also dispatching soldiers. So there would be like one French soldier coming in, a couple Germans coming in, some Finns, some Swedes. And I was viewing this as it is and as it was a tripwire force that if the Americans were to actually do something, they would have to deal with the foreign nationals, the French soldiers who were sitting there. And if you accidentally fire on a French soldier, then you accidentally have started a problem with another NATO power. And so I was fascinated by that, by this sort of concept that these countries, these allies, were sending in troops to keep the alliance from going to war against itself.
Mm-hmm. So you arrive in Nuuk, the capital city of Greenland, in early February. Mm-hmm. Describe what that first day was like.
So to get there from here, I had to go to Iceland, flew Toronto to Iceland and then Iceland back to Nuuk. And I arrived and I was picked up by a taxi at the airport. I mean, we've been told by some that, there's nothing there. But there is a community there. Nuuk is a capital city with, it has hospitals, it has a ski hill, it has a university, it has courthouses, it has hotels, and it has cabs. And so I jumped in a cab and I immediately just started talking to the cab driver. And he was the first person to explain to me how exhausting the conversation had become, that everybody was just so tired of having to respond to everything that Donald Trump and the Trump administration was saying about them and all the threats, et cetera. So I arrived on February 3rd. It was really a couple weeks after the war had essentially been fought. And I say that because the Greenland crisis, as it has now become known, escalated and sort of reached this boiling point at the same time that world leaders were descending on Davos in late January. That was
for the World Economic Forum.
For the World Economic Forum. That is where Mark Carney gave the now famous speech, but it's also where Donald Trump refused until he arrived to Davos to say that he would not invade Greenland. It wasn't until he was there that he had this sort of world waiting to hear what he was going to say that he said, we won't take it by military force. We could, but we won't.
I won't do that. Okay? Now everyone's saying, oh, good. That's probably the biggest statement I made because people thought I would use force. I don't have to use force. I don't want to use force. I won't use force.
At that time, the world's media was very much in Nuuk. Like they were having press conferences in Nuuk and they didn't have enough seats for the journalists. Like the world had descended there and then it had left. I came in after that to get a bit of a lay of the land of what was going on. And I timed my arrival also for this moment when diplomatic missions were arriving, one from Canada, one from France. And it was I wanted to see the diplomatic tripwires that were being set up.
So I want to talk about Trump, and I wanted to kind of talk about when this, what's the origin story of his obsession with Greenland. But before that, give me a sense of the mood, though, because you're there on that first day, you're talking to cab drivers, you're talking to folks. Like, what was your sense of how people were feeling, how they were doing?
I would say that people were angry. They were certainly exhausted. They were still on edge. I mean, I spoke to people who described to me, my lead character in the story is a man who he's a 51-year-old kitchen designer.
Jan Kohler, I think his name is. Jan
Kohler, yeah. He realized how all of this was impacting him when he found himself pulling a hunting rifle out of storage and bringing it into his bedroom so that he could sleep with a gun close by in case the Americans came. That is a conversation that I had over and over and over with people. It is a society, a place where there is quite a bit of hunting goes on. And so people do have guns, and they were starting to bring them in and keep them loaded and had them ready. I also spoke to many people who had escape plans, who had actually thought through what they would do if troops did start landing on the ground.
We had a plan that if it happens while we're at work, he needs to go pick up the kids, and then we'll meet at the city hall. And we even talked about, like, if there is a real annexion of our country, what country do we want to move to? And I know a lot of families have had those conversations, and just having those conversations, that in itself is very stressful and traumatizing.
Would they fight? Would they flee? If they were fleeing, would they simply run to the ice? Or would they try and get out of the country? So people were taking it very, very seriously. The impression that I had back here is like if I talked about how I was going to go to Greenland, I remember saying this in one of our, we teach together here at the Carleton School of Journalism and Communication. And I told some of my students that I was planning to go to Greenland. And I remember some of them didn't understand like why. Like this is just a bit of a joke story, isn't it? And I was like, no, this is very serious to the people there. And when I arrived, that was affirmed.
When did Donald Trump start talking about Greenland? Because it was even prior to 2025.
It was prior to 2020. It was in his first term. He canceled the meeting with the Danish leader because I can't follow everything that he says on social media, and I don't care to. But there was a comment of how if Greenland's not for sale, I don't see a reason why we should even meet. So it was always something that seemed to be there, at least in his first term, and it was very much amplified as soon as he was brought back to office when he won again in 2024. When he was president-elect, his son jumped on the Trump plane and flew into Nuuk.
In early January 2025.
Correct, yeah, right before Trump took office. It was very much a propaganda campaign. Trump Jr. arrived and his entourage went into the main square of Nuuk and began handing out money to people and MAGA hats and were bringing people into sort of one of the main hotels in Nuuk for a free lunch. It was all a social media campaign to try and show support within Greenland for unification or annexation with the United States. That became something that I heard a lot of Greenlanders tell me how that had really impacted them and changed their view of America and also their understanding of how serious this was.
Do we know why Donald Trump is so fixated with Greenland? Like, what's his desire to own the place about? What was the impetus for that?
Well, he has said publicly that he sees it as a real estate transaction. He sees it as something that is just like a huge chunk of land that would be a magnificent piece of real estate for America to own. It has strategic value. It has always had strategic value.
Why?
Its proximity to the north, its proximity to Russia.
It's really on the front line, isn't it? Like it's in between the United States or North America and Russia.
Yes, absolutely. And the American space base in Patuxent is, I believe it is their most northern base. It's also, there's obviously a lot of mineral wealth in Greenland that becomes increasingly important as the ice melts. But Donald Trump is not the first American president to have had an interest in Greenland. This goes all the way back to really the American Civil War. It was right after the Civil War. It was Abraham Lincoln's Secretary of State, who then became his successor's Secretary of State after his assassination.
William Seward.
Yes, who made the very first offer to purchase Greenland. And that had something to do with Canada as well. That was right after the Alaska Purchase. And
Which involved the United States basically purchasing the territory that's now Alaska from Russia.
Yes, exactly. And it was a strategic move to basically encircle the newly formed Dominion of Canada. That went nowhere. The Danes were not interested in selling. It begins there. It resurfaced again in 1910. There was an effort to try and swap some islands around so America could obtain it. In 1916, the Americans actually recognized Danish sovereignty over Greenland. And that held until 1940, when all of a sudden Denmark was overrun by Nazi Germany. And the Americans obtained a deal with kind of an exiled ambassador for what was the government in Denmark, but did not actually represent Denmark at the time, made the deal to allow the Americans to protect Greenland. And that's what opened up the doors to the American military presence there. And they have never left.
Because the Americans were really rattled at the fact that Nazi Germany had invaded Denmark. Like, it was a little bit too close for comfort.
And after the war, after World War II, there was another push to purchase Greenland.
During the Cold War.
As the Cold War was really getting cold, right? As it was starting up, but it was turned down. Donald Trump's actions and his motivations follow this track, follow this interest that has always been there.
And in the last, 30, 40 years, like, what has been the relationship between Greenland and the United States? You talked about, the Cold War. It was a kind of it was a buffer, like the United States saw it as being a buffer, as a way of kind of protecting it from.
They also saw it as a nuclear playground, though. So there was, during the 60s, there was a project called Project Iceworm, where the Americans were trying to hide nuclear silos with nuclear missiles in the ice. Almost like a James Bond kind of thing that was going on.
The Danes didn't realize this was going on. Like, the Americans concealed this program.
Yeah, it was not fully understood by the Danish what was happening. They ultimately abandoned that because they concluded that the ice was it moves around too much. Ice shifts, and so you can't have these nuclear silos in the ice because it's not stable. There is still some nuclear waste in the ice cap there that will ultimately become exposed as the ice melts away. That's one way that they used it as a testing ground. The other thing that they did is there was this project called, it was called Operation Chrome Dome. And this was a concept, this was where the Americans actually, I think they fell behind the Russians in the number of warheads that they had. And so what they had concocted was this idea that you would always have a nuclear deterrent that was airborne, that could not be wiped out at any given time. And so they had these B-52 bombers that were just sort of perpetually flying around. This is, Dr. Strangelove, literally. And you had this one bomber that had taken off, or it was on approach. It was over Greenland, and there was a fire broke out inside the plane, and they crashed. And it dropped warheads, and just parts of nuclear weapons were just spread all over the ice, and they needed to be cleaned up.
And this is like 12 kilometers, I think, away from the base.
Yeah, right? They technically crashed in the sea, or on the ice, and they were rescued by dog sleds, which becomes interesting because that's one thing that the Greenlanders that I spoke to. So they took offense to the fact that Trump is ridiculing that there's nothing up here. It's just ice. They're bold enough to say the people here actually want to join us, even though they don't, and also ridiculing their defensive capacity. That it's just a couple dog sled teams.
In Greenland, basically, their defense is 2 dog sleds. Do you know that? You know what their defense is? 2 dog sleds. You know what Denmark did recently to boost up security in Greenland? They added 1 more dog sled. In the meantime, you have Russian destroyers and submarines and China destroyers and submarines all over the place.
Well, he doesn't understand that this is sophisticated technology.
Yes.
Like, the dogs do things that the other pieces of technology can't.
Yeah. Things like the dogs will not break down in the same way that a tracked vehicle will.
Or a drone.
Yeah. I mean, oil loses its viscosity when it reaches a certain, when the temperature drops. So stuff just grinds to a halt. Dogs will continue to move. You just need to keep them fed.
Yeah. I wanted to take a moment to thank you for listening to In Bed with the Elephant. If you can, please follow us in the app that you're using. If you already follow us, thank you. And please do take the time to leave a rating or a review. It helps to get more people listening to our show. And please keep spreading the word about us to your networks. In a world drowning in misinformation and disinformation, never has the work of journalists been more important. That's why we here at In Bed with the Elephant are so grateful to our podcast's founding sponsor, Perfect Books, for their support of independent journalism. Perfect Books is an independent bookstore located at 258A Elgin Street in the heart of downtown Ottawa. Perfect Books, a store for book lovers.
After the war, we gave Greenland back to Denmark. How stupid were we to do that? But we did it. But we gave it back. But how ungrateful are they now?
U.S. President Donald Trump is standing firm that Greenland must be under American control and that it needs the island for security.
The president has been very open and clear with all of you and with the world that he views it in the best interest of the United States to deter Russian and Chinese aggression in the Arctic region. And so that's why his team is currently talking about what a potential purchase would look like.
What is then the agreement between the United States and Greenland or Denmark? Like what can the United States do? Because Donald Trump seemed to be suggesting that he needs to own the place in order to do the things he wants to do with it. So what is the agreement exactly?
So the current agreement, it goes back to the Cold War era. It goes back to the 50s. And it is that the Americans have the ability to build bases. They can move troops there. At one point, they had, I think, like almost 10,000 troops there. They have the capacity to build more bases. The issue here seems to be about sovereignty over the land, sovereignty over the mineral rights, sovereignty over all of it. And so this is the scary part, I think, for a lot of Greenlanders, the ones that I spoke to, is that even though he said that he will not invade, he has made it clear that he expects to be given sovereignty, that the Americans should be given sovereignty over the current space where the space base is, and perhaps more. And that is a scary concept when you start talking about like sovereignty. Sovereignty and mineral rights. This seems to be what it's all about.
And these are people, we're talking about the Greenlandic Inuit, these are people who have been fighting for their independence, or fighting for their freedom, for autonomy for a very long time.
And this is sort of going back to sort of, I think, some of the misconceptions that I had about Greenland going in. I knew that Greenland was 89% Inuit, that the population, there's 56,000 people there. Nuuk is a city of 20,000. Of the 56,000 people, 89% are Inuit. The rest are mostly European. What I did not understand really until getting there is that the Inuit population is, if you look at the globe, if you sort of stop looking at it from the center lines that we sort of look at it, right, where the equator is kind of the middle of the planet. If you just sort of look from the top down and you start to look, you see that Greenland and Canada are really very close to each other. Then when you start to think of how people lived there traditionally and for more than 1,000 years, it's the same people who were in Greenland as were in the Northwest Territories and the Northern Canadian archipelago there. These are semi-nomadic people who went back and forth.
They're family.
They're family. And I'm there hearing like all this talk of, this bond and this connection between Canada and Greenland and how we stand together. And we're not standing against the United States. We're standing in support of the Greenlanders. But then at the same time, there's this other thing that's happening where this plane load of Inuit coming from Quebec arrived.
A large Inuit delegation has also traveled with them for the event. More than 60 Inuit from Canada there.
Most people who live on this Arctic island are Inuit. So the Inuit from Canada share a similar culture, language, and even have family members here.
Inuit, we have everything in common with each other.
They say they want to stand united in the face of threats from U.S. President Donald Trump.
We need to stand firm on our homeland to show unity from across the Arctic, that we are one people.
We want to come together in solidarity with Greenland and to show our support and to say, that land is not for sale.
They're flying the Canadian flag and the Greenlandic flag side by side with each other. And I'm sort of looking at this and thinking something's being lost here. This looks on television and looks on social media as if it's people are coming to fly the flags of these two countries. But what it really is these are the family members of the people who live there coming to give their support. These are the cousins of the Greenlanders who just happen to live on our side of the border that we put there.
This is an example, I think you used the term, of circumpolar solidarity.
Yes, exactly. Precisely. And it's something that needed to be it needed to be shown to me in order for me to understand it. I went in knowing that the population was Inuit. I didn't understand what that really meant, that the bonds between the Inuit communities on both sides of the border, how that really plays out.
What is the official relationship between Greenland and Denmark? Because it seems a little bit confusing.
It's a semi-autonomous landmass that exists inside the Danish realm.
So it's in the kingdom of Denmark,
yes.
But it has some
They have their own
freedoms.
foreign affairs. Yeah, they have their own foreign affairs minister. They have their own legislature.
Are they a country? Are they their own country, would you say?
I sort of came away thinking of it kind of like, what is Scotland? What is Wales? What is Northern Ireland? I mean, sometimes they are referred to as countries. Other times they are not.
And what has been the relationship between the Greenlanders and the Danes? How would you describe that relation? And how do the Greenlanders see the Danes?
Depending on who you talk to, you will get a different story. There are former politicians there and active politicians there who explained to me that this has been a long struggle to break away from Denmark. And so the concept of having yet another colonial power, another foreign power coming in and trying to colonize us is like, this will just set us backwards. I heard that from many people. I also heard others almost defend Denmark, including some politicians who had for years advocated for Greenlandic independence, who said, no, that, our relationship with Denmark it is being rewritten by those who would like to say that they are our colonial oppressors. It's people from the outside who are trying to say that this is the same story as, we saw with the British and the French and the Spanish in other parts of the world. It is not that. So I sort of walk away with an understanding myself that there are lots of different ways to look at this relationship. At the current moment, most people described it to me as a partnership between Denmark and Greenland.
And would it be fair to say that the majority of Greenlanders see themselves as being in solidarity, that they have this compact with Denmark that needs to be maintained in the face of this threat represented by Donald Trump's United States?
It's more nuanced than that, I would say. It's probably, I think that the Canadian relationship with the Crown is perhaps a fair example here to look at, that there are always going to be those who do not believe that we should still be a constitutional monarchy, that we should still have any connection to Mother Britain. But bringing King Charles here to open our parliament served a nice purpose, didn't it, when we were under threat from the United States? I don't know that that necessarily has people here or there wanting to strengthen the ties, but you sort of use what you have, I suppose, to try and stand alone if you can.
One thing that I think is made clear throughout, and it really is a brilliant piece that you've written for the Walrus, is the relationship, the intimate relationship that the Greenlandic Inuit have with the land.
Absolutely.
It's really at the core of their identity. Can you talk about that relationship and how it manifested itself in your trip there?
Yeah, so it's a place where you need to be able to interact with nature in order to survive it. It is cold. The fisheries are a big part of the economy. You've also got a population, as I said, that hunts a lot and explores on foot into the fjords. There's a respect for nature. Like, you notice it immediately. There's not really, I didn't see any garbage.
Like you say, there's no litter.
There was no litter. In the historic port of Nuuk, there is a statue. She was called the Mother of the Sea. There's this legend that when people take more than they need from the sea, she sort of punishes humanity. It's just this concept that, like, you need to respect Mother Nature or you will feel her wrath. This is where, like, the mineral rights become part of the story, because so much of Greenland is kind of uncharted and untouched, and the people want it to remain that way. That they don't want to see this end up like what we have done to every other corner of this world. They want it to. They don't like the thought of it of like mining trucks coming in and just exploitation. It's just it's off-putting.
And I think you capture it in the story of a Canadian living in Greenland. Maybe you can tell us a little bit about James Deason.
For sure. Yeah. So James Deason was another one of these interesting people that I met. He chose to live there because of family now, but the original attraction was the wilderness. He's a guy who had grown up on the outskirts of Vancouver and lived in the Kelowna area, and then went to Greenland and just fell in love with what he saw and moved there. And he told me this story that I found very haunting. And when he told it, he said that it had given him just this uncomfortable sense of foreboding. He described to me taking a boat deep into the fjord, getting out on foot and walking into this sort of marshland where he's describing, it sounds almost like Middle Earth to me. And he's got a gun over his shoulder and he comes upon a dump site. 2 massive craters in the earth that were obviously done by dynamite that are just filled with barrels and barrels and barrels of oil. And when he looked at that and he realized this is what they're fighting against, that this is what they want to contain. Now, everyone that I spoke to said that that was most likely he stumbled upon a former American military site because they can't figure out what else that might have been. And there's so many of those kinds of dump sites that it must be what it was. And his view was that this is what the future will hold if Greenland changes.
These are people who are literally fighting for their territory's life. Like they're fighting to preserve, as you're saying, the pristine nature of it.
That fight that is a losing battle, right? Because the ice is melting. And though Greenland might remain pristine and people may not be desecrating the earth, it doesn't necessarily matter because they're impacted by how the rest of us are living elsewhere, right?
You went to Greenland, obviously, as a journalist. You were a professor at Carleton University. You're also a Canadian, and you're looking at Greenland, I would argue, through a Canadian lens.
Yeah.
And you think that there's a lesson for Canadians in what's happening in Greenland right now. What is, and the title is, I went to Greenland and saw a warning for Canada. What's the warning that you're talking about?
I saw many warnings for Canada. I originally went to Greenland, and as you point out, with this sort of Canadian, looked at it through the Canadian lens. I went there thinking if this falls, if this
domino falls.
Yeah, if this domino falls, if NATO goes to war with itself, if this becomes America, there are currently politicians in the United States who have tabled legislation to try and make this happen, including one who says that Greenland should actually be renamed Red, White, and Blue Land. So I go there thinking, okay, if you can make those arguments, if those arguments prevail in Greenland, what is to stop those arguments from spreading across the narrow channel into Ellesmere Island, into Baffin Island? That is very much a Canadian-centric view of this story. That is me thinking, how does this impact me and us? When I arrived there, it took a while, but I realized that that is not really a very helpful way to look at this. That is me and us sort of looking at this from a very selfish perspective as opposed to actually looking at how this is impacting them.
Meaning the people.
The people there.
Yeah.
The warning is, so the cover of this was ultimately the cover story for the June issue of the Walrus. And the cover says, I went to Greenland and I saw a warning for Canada. Inside the story, my real thesis statement is that I basically saw a story of loyalty and betrayal.
European military personnel are arriving in Greenland in what's being called a show of support for its sovereignty.
Troops from Denmark arriving in Greenland's capital, Nuuk. France says it is also sending troops and has them on the ground there. The Netherlands will also join NATO allies. That includes Sweden, Germany, Finland, and Norway in a Danish-led military exercise.
The White House says none of that changes the U.S. position.
I'm there writing about the tripwires that are being set up, and I'm looking at all of the gestures, the diplomatic and military gestures that are being made by the global community to support Greenland. And yet, the entire time that I am there, the Canadian military was, for lack of another word, doing war games with the American military up at the Patuxent Space Base. The warning as I see it, and I continue to see it, is we cannot be on both sides of this issue. You cannot be there supporting Greenland and also be doing war exercises with the American military at the same time that the American president is threatening to take over the place.
Or maybe you can. Isn't that what Canada often does? There's a double game going on.
This is increasingly, if we go back to the words that were actually spoken by Mark Carney in Davos, I now think I sort of understand them more and more.
So we're engaging broadly, strategically, with open eyes. We actively take on the world as it is, not wait around for a world we wish to be.
The Greenlanders, like, they were all watching this speech. Everybody that I spoke to was like, we watched. They know who Mark Carney is. They were kind of clapping for him when he says that we were experiencing a rupture in the world order, the end of a pleasant fiction, and the beginning of a harsh reality where the large main powers of geopolitics have no constraints. He spoke of Canada shifting its strategic posture to something more principled and pragmatic.
Principled in our commitment to fundamental values, sovereignty, territorial integrity, the prohibition of the use of force except when consistent with the UN Charter, and respect for human rights. And pragmatic in recognizing that progress is often incremental, that interests diverge, that not every partner will share all of our values.
It's the pragmatic element there that I think is what we're sort of seeing here. You can have this principled stance, but at the same time, you're doing something else. And that's what I saw there. And I do see a warning there. I also saw a couple other things that came to mind is like at the same time that I'm talking to people about how this propaganda exercise that Trump Jr. had done on the ground, how that had played out for them and how they saw how dangerous this was and how unified the response was to be like, no, the largest protests in Greenlandic history occurred in January. People saying, no, we do not want to become part of America.
And this was a huge protest, like I think, 5,000 people, which is basically 10% of the population. It's equivalent to, 4.15 million Canadians walking through, demonstrating in Ottawa. Like, it's a big deal. That was a big deal.
Yeah, at the same time that is happening, we have our own separatist movements here, and leaders of our separatist movements are going to meet with people in Washington. I mean, the unified response that I saw in Greenland to oppose annexation by the United States, I have not seen that here in our own ranks when we're told, we should just erase the border between Canada and the United States and this concept of, becoming the 51st state. I think that we are much more divided on this issue. So I see that like all of these are sort of the warnings that were in my mind as I went through this process.
You spent a week in Greenland listening to the stories of Greenlanders, and they told you that, quote, they longed for a stronger bond with Canada. Longed is a very, very potent word. Like longing is not, that's serious business. There's something very sincere and real about that word longing. Why did you use that word longing for a stronger bond with Canada? Because it seems significant to me.
One thing that people kept telling me is how alone they felt. And I think that when we feel
isolated,
isolated, like you have no friends, you have no partner, there's no one going to come to your aid, and so you long for something more. You long for some sort of a relationship. That was how the sentiment was put to me. One woman actually described that she'd always known that she was connected to Canada. She had a connection to the Inuit in Canada, but that she felt that she had been brainwashed by the Danes to see her heritage and her history as actually being European. And so she was one who told me that she longed for a stronger bond with Canada because she viewed the history, especially the northern history in Canada and Greenland, as being the everlasting bond, the everlasting unity. The other thing is, like when I was there, Mary Simon was there as well.
The first Inuit Governor General of Canada.
Yes. And my respect for her position was like off the charts. Here's someone who is technically there representing the British Crown, there to fly the Canadian flag, give support to a Canadian diplomatic mission in a role that she would never normally have this role. But here she is actually speaking to her people in her language, in their language, right? And expressing that we are there for them. We are there in their hour of need. And that's something that another source, a man from one of the 80 Inuit who had gone to Greenland to support them, he had said, no one should have to cry out for help in order for you to hear them. And so he had chosen to go to show that he heard them. There was this emotional connection that I witnessed. When you see the people there hugging the Inuit who had come from Canada and actually crying while they're hugging them, there was a longing there that I saw that nobody's hugging the Canadian diplomatic corps who are there to, figure out where to put the flag and what to say to the media. It's far more natural to see like your long lost brothers and sisters and cousins come back to say we see you, we feel you, we know what's happening here.
Brett Popplewell, thanks so much.
Thank you.
You've been listening to In Bed with the Elephant, a production of Ricochet Media. Let us know what you think about our show by leaving a review on Apple Podcasts. You can follow the podcast on Apple, Spotify, Amazon, iHeartRadio, YouTube, or wherever you find your podcasts. The producer, editor, and sound engineer of In Bed with the Elephant is Dave Sarazin. The video editor is Dennis Gonzales. Executive producers Ethan Cox and Andrea Houston. Music by Parker Harewood. Production assistants Desiree Nickfarjam and Sofia de Guzman Rivadero. Graphics by Sarwa Abdul. Interns Gabriel Ryan and Juan Suarez. I'm Adrian Harewood. See you next time. Portions of In Bed with the Elephant are recorded at Carleton University School of Journalism and Communication. Email sjcstudios@carleton.ca for a list of available podcast services and prices.